I've just found my favorite monitor that I can recommend to everyone. It's called the Philips Evnia 27M2N8500, which sports a 26.5-inch flat glossy QD-OLED panel that operates 1440p at a refresh rate of 360Hz. It also has got adaptive sync support and G-Sync compatibility, and better still, DisplayHDR True Black 400 certification. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for £650, while in the US it can be found for $650. In this review, I'll be explaining as to why I absolutely love this monitor and why you should potentially consider it over some of its competitors. So to kick things off, I would like to talk about its input lag, and here I had it objectively tested at 0 milliseconds, giving me CRT-like performance, and indeed it does a shockingly good job. Now, the same could be said about some of the other monitors that I've recently tested, although I would like to draw your attention to one of the MSI monitors, which has the similar sort of specifications as this one, which clocked in at 1 milliseconds. Nonetheless, it's negligible differences. Now, when it comes to my subjective opinion, I can say that while playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, my mouse inputs were instantaneously received by the monitor, and yes, I was able to click some heads off. Now, it is worth mentioning over here that this experience and also the objective measurement that I recorded was with the low input lag mode enabled via the monitor's OSD. I'm not really sure why you'd ever want to disable it. However, if you were to enable adaptive sync technologies such as AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, it will grey out the option. Now, from my own subjective testing over here, I didn't notice a massive extra degree of input lag that was added on while the option was greyed out. But it's just something I thought I should share with you just in case you're wondering. If you do enable HDR, however, with adaptive sync technologies disabled, the low input lag mode is still able to be enabled and disabled. Now, aside from its very impressive input lag, the monitor's response time is also very good. And this is of course no surprise for those people who come across OLED monitors, because indeed in comparison to a regular LCD, in other words a TN, IPS or VA, an OLED will come out on top. Here you'll be able to see via the OSRTD tool that the average initial time, which translates to average D to G, clocked in at just 1.08 milliseconds, while the percent in window sat at 93%, therefore showing that this monitor is really hitting that 360Hz refresh rate range. Now, the RGB overshoot should actually be 0 across the board, but due to the hardware limitations over here, you might see some numbers a little bit above 0. Nonetheless, over here, there's no inverse ghosting to worry about, and as a result means that the overall motion clarity and what you're able to see on your screen is absolutely faultless. Indeed, over here you can see the UFO ghosting deaths at 360Hz, and this means that the overall motion clarity and also the overall image quality at 360Hz is absolutely spectacular. Now, downside, however, is this monitor does not have any sort of motion blur reduction technologies, MBR for short, which you might come to expect in a high refresh rate monitor, specifically if you look at LCD panels, namely TNs out there. Now, this doesn't really bother me in the slightest, as I highlighted before, due to the overall motion clarity at 360Hz. However, for those people who are playing on console and also on PC, the MBR function would have been appreciated at, for example, 120Hz, where the overall motion could have been a little bit clearer. Speaking of which, a quick word for console gamers over here, the monitor will run 120Hz and 60Hz at 1440p. You can also accept a 4K signal input, which gives it good sort of versatility, therefore allowing you to, for example, connect a 4K Blu-ray player directly into the monitor and downscale it to 1440p. As for how it performs across the board, well, indeed over here at 120Hz using the OSRTD tool, you can see that it has an average initial time of just 1.12 milliseconds, hitting 100% of the 120Hz refresh rate window. The same could be said at 60Hz, where it is still hitting 100% of that window with the average initial time of just 1.2 milliseconds. In other words, the monitor is very much capable at the lower refresh rate ranges as well. Now, this actually perfectly brings me onto adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync. Now, the monitor does not have a native G-Sync module, and as such its VR range sits from 48 up to 360Hz, which still gives it a good sort of headroom to play around with. Now, the monitor has got G-Sync compatibility, and I can certify that while using an RTX 3080 and connected over DisplayPort, I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo with G-Sync enabled. Now, it is worth noting, however, that this OLED, very much like others out there on the market, does suffer from some VRR flicker. And unfortunately over here, Philips has not provided you any sort of countermeasures like some competitors do, such as the likes of Asus. Nonetheless, over here, the flickering didn't really throw me off, be it in terms of looking at the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, or better still, in a real-world scenario while playing a game such as Destiny 2. Now here I was playing Destiny 2 at 1440p at 360Hz with NVIDIA G-Sync enabled, and also enabling HDR. Now all these technologies ran in tandem together and I didn't encounter any problems. Now in terms of the overall HDR reproduction, it's absolutely phenomenal. This has an OLED panel, a QD-OLED panel to be more specific, and has got a peak brightness of up to 1000 nits, at least if you go into one of the HDR modes. If, however, you want something that gives you a little bit of extra depth and gives you that better sort of contrast, you might want to go on the DisplayHDR True Black 400 mode. And this will limit the overall peak brightness at roughly 400 nits, but will give you an even better HDR experience. In my case, I was left absolutely jaw-dropped while playing a game like Destiny 2, and I do think it's up there with some of the best HDR gaming monitors out there on the market. Now, it's safe to say that I'm very much impressed by its overall gaming performance, but what about when it comes to the overall image quality? Well, as a reminder, you've got a flat 26.5-inch 1440p monitor that has a glossy QD OLED panel. Now, the glossy panel will very much be appreciated by certain individuals, although it's worth noting over here that you might get some extra glare. For example, if you have got a window positioned behind you and therefore facing the monitor, you might be able to see the reflections. If, however, you are going to be gaming in a slightly different setup, or of course going to be using this monitor in a darker room, then it shouldn't be a problem whatsoever. The glossy panel does have its advantages when it comes to its image quality, which I'm going to expand onto right now. Now here, the monitor has got a dedicated sRGB, Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 color modes, which is very much appreciated. And you've also got full brightness controls and RGB modes as well that you can adjust yourself. Now, using the sRGB mode to start off with, I clocked in a gamut coverage of 98% and a gamut volume of 103.2%. Below you can see how it compares to the standards. The average LTE sits at just 1.39 with a maximum of 2.5, therefore meaning this monitor can be used for serious image editing work or video grading in the sRGB color space. The tested contrast ratio sat at infinity to 1, given the fact that it's an OLED panel, while its measured white point clocked in at 6318 Kelvin at 100%. In terms of its gamma curve, it's a little bit off the 2.2 standard, but not too far off what I would actually expect. Now, it's similarly impressive in the Adobe RGB mode, clocking in 94.6% in gamut coverage and 98.2% in gamut volume. Yet again over here, the average LTE and the maximum LTE are very good at 1.36 and 2.81 respectively. Yet again, you can do some serious image editing work in the Adobe RGB space as well. The tested contrast ratio does not shift, while the measured white point is closer at 6566 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, as you might have expected, it's not too far off the 2.2 standard. Now, shifting to the DCI-P3 color space, it's not as impressive, but still pretty good. The gamut coverage clocked in at 97.8% and a gamut volume of 108.7%. As for the average LTE, it sits at 1.84 and a maximum of 4.71. The measured white point is clocked in at 6562 Kelvin at 100%, and as for its gamma curve in comparison to the 2.6 standard, and yes indeed the gamma was set at 2.6 via the OSD, you can see that it's a little bit off. So past the overall color performance, what about when it comes to brightness? Well, here in HDR with a small percentage window in a black background, I clocked in a peak of 983 nits. As for the True Black 400 mode, it went up to 449 nits. Now in terms of the SDR brightness, it came in at 248 nits, which is a lot dimmer than most LCD panels and certain OLEDs out there on the market. However, if you're running this monitor in a bright sunlit room, you'll be able to run it at roughly 80 to 95% brightness without having any sort of issues. Better still, it has got great sort of range as it goes all the way down to 11 nits, meaning you can use this in a completely pitch black environment without troubling your eyes. Now, aside from peak luminance, in terms of the overall brightness uniformity of my tested panel, it did phenomenal across the board, as you'll be able to see from this test. And as for the backlight bleed, well, it's non-existent. Thanks to the fact that this is an OLED, it can switch off all the pixels, and as such, you've got a completely pitch black image. This image was actually taken in a completely dark room, but my camera actually overexposed the light that was within it. Now I'm sure you're loving what you're seeing so far, however there's certain limitations that you should consider before purchasing this Philips monitor. And of course over here I'm referring to the OLED panel that it's actually using. The same would be said about any sort of OLED monitor out there. Now first off we have to talk about the burn-in effect. And yes, that's going to be inherent on any sort of OLED panel, but here the manufacturer provides you a warranty and also ways of mitigating it by the use of screensaver, pixel orbiting, pixel refresh, auto warning, multi-logo protection, boundary dimmer, taskbar dimmer, and also a thermal protection. So yes, the manufacturer has actually gone above and beyond in order to provide you all the means of mitigating the burn-in effect. But of course, some people out there will just not want to go for an OLED purely because of the potential risks of having burn-in in comparison to, for example, an LCD panel. Now another thing to consider is text legibility, and by that I mean the fringing effect and the sub-pixel layout of OLED panels. Indeed, it differs from a regular LCD panel. Now here you'll be hopefully able to see how this QD-OLED panel compares to some other QD-OLEDs and also a WOLED, be it a first generation or a second generation panel, the latter being the better out of the two, at least when it comes to WOLEDs. Personally, I had no problems whatsoever when it came to text legibility on this QD-OLED panel, but of course it will take a little bit of getting used to when you're comparing and contrasting it with a regular LCD panel. So past all of that, I would like to talk about its overall build quality. And here the 26.5-inch monitor doesn't take up too much space on your desk due to the fact you've got a three-side bullet design, a very thin profile due to an OLED panel, and also a thin bottom bezel, which by the way is in silver and does stand out over its key competitors, which are in all black. Furthermore, over here, the stand is a little bit different as well because it's made in part of recycled material, which is very much appreciated, and has got a white and silver or grey-ish finish to it. Now the stand itself is very sturdy, and it provides you height, swivel and tilt adjustments, although the monitor cannot be pivoted with the built-in stand, but that doesn't really bother me in the slightest. If that is something that you're looking for, you can replace the monitor stand with a VESA-compatible stand thanks to an adapter that's provided within the box. Now looking at the back of the monitor, you will notice an all-white finish, and I do think this has been done on purpose because it further accentuates the RGB lights that are positioned around it. Now normally I'm not fond of any sort of light on a monitor because they don't really serve a purpose, but in this respect the Philips Ambiglow technology is a great inclusion, especially at this price point. It effectively gives you an extra degree of immersion while you're gaming or indeed consuming content on the monitor. You can also customize it of course with a static color or of course one that it's changing every now and then. Now Philips's Ambiglow technology is not going to compare to Philips's Ambilight technology like you'd find on their televisions, but nonetheless in the monitor space, and of course if you're using it in a completely pitch black environment near a wall, it will actually be a nice sort of extra feature that you might want to use. Now for you to control the lighting effect, you'll want to navigate on the monitor's OSD, which can be done via a small little joystick button that's found at the bottom right hand side and at the back of the monitor. Now the OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out and provides you all the options that you require, although it does take a little bit of getting used to the overall layout, and also the contrast between purple and white can be a little bit hard to see. However, you have also got the Evnia Precision Center software which you can install, and this effectively gives you the same sort of options, if not a little bit extra, what you'll find from the hardware-based OSD. Now the software itself again is very comprehensively laid out, but will require you the USB Type B to Type A cable to be connected into your computer. Now 3D Monitor's OSD, you might have noticed a volume setting, and yes indeed the monitor has got two 5-watt speakers built in, which will suffice for basic music listening or indeed Windows notifications, although I'd always suggest a set of headphones, a DAC, a headset or of course a set of bookshelf speakers. Now the monitor has also got a 3.5mm jack output, which can be handy in certain scenarios. Now this actually perfectly brings me on to connectivity, and here you've got a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input and two full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, therefore allowing you to output 1440p at 360Hz at up to 10-bit, and in certain cases even up to 12-bit. Now it is also worth mentioning over here that the HDMI ports have got a dedicated HDMI 120Hz mode that you can select via the monitor's OSD, handy for example for console gamers. And yes, as I mentioned before, you have got that 4K signal input as well. Now you have also got two USB Type-A 3.2 Gen 1 ports, which can be handy for connecting up peripherals or of course a USB drive directly into the monitor. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and if it wasn't obvious already, I absolutely love this Philips Evnia monitor. It really does tick every single box that you might be looking for, and even undercuts its main rivals by roughly £200 in the UK or $200 in the US. It gives you a fantastic input lag, great response time, has got that fluid 360Hz refresh rate and that 1440p resolution, which in my opinion is the sweet spot for gamers. You've also got good sort of console capabilities and also adaptive sync technologies with G-Sync certification, and better still, a phenomenal HDR experience, color accuracy in the sRGB, Adobe RGB, and to an extent the DCI-P3 color spaces, and a QD-OLED panel which is glossy, which will give you good sort of text legibility and give you the benefits of having a glossy panel in comparison to a matte panel. Truthfully, I can see myself highly recommending this monitor, and I would go as far as saying it's one of the favorite monitors that I've reviewed to date. As a result, it easily gets my Best Buy award. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of this monitor down in the comment section below, and if you've enjoyed this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.